Hi there, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Mark. And today we're in chapter 15 and verses 33 to 41 as we focus on Jesus' crucifixion. Now, last week we noticed that Mark did not spend time focusing on the physical suffering, as intense and horrible as that would have been, but he emphasized Scripture being fulfilled. Today he gives us three events which are very, very important. Have you ever been reading a book or you've been watching a film and you read it, you think it's okay, or you watch the film and you get through it, but you think, I don't really understand that. And then the film comes on the television, or you decide to read the book again. And this time as you go through, you start to notice things in the plot. And because of that, the whole plot comes together, the book makes sense, the film makes sense, you enjoy it so much more. Well, this is the reason Mark puts in three things that we must focus on if we are to understand Jesus' death. Now, the first one is this, verse 33, the darkness. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, this is supposed to sort of get us unsettled. There's something wrong about this, isn't there? It's not an eclipse. Passover was never on a full moon. And anyway, it's 3 hours. So what does it mean? Well, someone once said that the Bible is the best commentary on itself. So the first thing we have to do is look at where we've seen things like this or read about things like this in the Bible. And we can go to Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 to 29, where one of the plagues against the Egyptians who were persecuting the Hebrews was this darkness that came over the whole land of Egypt for 3 days. In Amos 8, verse 9, one of the minor prophets, it talks about darkness in daylight as a form of judgment. So this is showing us that God is angry. What's he angry at? Secondly, there's the cry, verse 34. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is this despair? Well, no, it's looking at something we looked at last week. It probably is a form of despair and anguish, but it's quoting Psalm 22, verse 1, where an innocent man is suffering. And notice where it comes. It comes at the 9th hour, at the end of the darkness. Jesus is experiencing God's judgment against sin. Our sin, our wrongdoing, our rebellion against God, just put simply, making ourselves the centre of our own little universe, going our own way, doing our own thing, will be judged by God. But Jesus gives us the opportunity to be forgiven and takes the judgment on himself. And here's the interesting thing. This comes at the end of the darkness as the judgment is being lifted. It is lifted by Christ becoming literally sin for us. We can read about that in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, where it says this, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus gives us a righteousness because he was the perfect man. He was the one who obeyed all of God's commands. And he takes our wrongdoing, our rebellion. So there's darkness, there's the cry, and then lastly, there's the curtain in the temple. We read in verse 37 and 38 this, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, this temple was, this curtain in the temple was enormous. It was a heavy fabric, and the basic job it had was to divide and separate the people from what was called the Holy of Holies, very much in the Jewish mindset where God was. And any person who could go in there was a priest, maybe once in a lifetime. And he'd go in for a special ceremony, and he had to do all the right things and the right sacrifices. So he was seen as, you know, his sin had been dealt with. No one could just go in there for a second or peep round the side. But here's the thing, it's ripped. Everyone can see in. Here's the wonderful thing. Everyone has access to God if their sins are forgiven. Why? Because Christ has taken that sin. The centurion's reaction is interesting. Verse 39. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." I don't think he had full understanding, but he'd seen a lot of guys die and a lot of guys being executed, and there was something extraordinary about what he was watching. Something quite extraordinary. And here is the extraordinary work of Jesus at the cross. Here is the thing that Mark has been drawing us to through all the teaching, through all the miracles, through everything Jesus has said and done. This is what he came to do. Where does that leave us? Well, here's the wonderful thing, and this is quite something. And if you're a Jew, you'd really understand this. I'm going to explain it a bit. In Hebrews, a letter to some Jewish Christians, the writer writes this. This is Hebrews 4, verse 14 through to 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. No one could go into the inner sanctuary of the temple. But the picture here is Jesus not just going in, but his followers being able to go. Those who've had their sins forgiven, being able to go with him. Where Jesus goes, his people can go when their sins are forgiven. Thank you for listening.